Hello and welcome to Dotting the I in Spaceship, a podcast about science fiction and writing. I'm Bob and this is episode 10. This week I want to talk about the concept of subverting expectations, but before we get to that, some quick housekeeping. Last week I wrote a blog post about getting your head down and chugging through the work. On Tuesday I released a free flash fiction story called The Artifact, written from the prompt, Someone in the Future Finds a Book. I did a review of Doctor Who Season 11, and my Patreon exclusive flash fiction was called Cambrian Delights, from the prompt Underwater Jurassic Park. Next week there will be a blog, a free story, a review, a Patreon exclusive, and a podcast, so keep your eyes and ears peeled. My original plan was to have everything up to date and start pushing the podcast and all of my writing from the 1st of September, and I'm recording this on the 16th. Which is a podcast that should have been recorded on the 6th of September, I think. So I'm, well behind in my schedule. I'm getting the work done regularly, so I'm actually keeping up with being about a week behind constantly, but I'm just not getting the extra work done that I need to get in front. Fortunately, this week I am going to be free all weekend, not doing anything else, so I'll be getting everything slogged out. I'm going to try and push during the week to get on top of things and to get ahead to make the weekend even easier, maybe even get in front. Which, I'll admit, I've been saying that for more than a month, so we'll see what happens. But, that said, every weekend for the last month I've also been doing something on some days of the weekend. Last weekend I spent most of the time working on my car over the whole weekend, so I was riding around. I would go and do some painting and then I would come back and I would have an hour while I needed to leave the painting to dry. So I would try and slog out a story and then get back down. And so instead of focusing on doing one thing, I was trying to maximize my efficiency, which is good because I got some work done. But it's still, I had the time to be able to put into it, but instead, because I was tired from working on a sander and from spending 8 hours working on the car on Friday and not having enough sleep, Resistance said to me, "Oh, it's fine. You can just play computer games and just for an hour, just for a little bit, just have a quick bit of rest and build up your strength." And so, of course, I played computer games for like 6 hours on Saturday and didn't get any work done. Anyhow, it's an ongoing battle, and will continue to fight it. Before I get into the main topic for today, I want to thank those people who have supported me on Patreon. Currently, my Wall of Awesome has only 3 names on it. You can get your name on there by supporting me at any level, and you can reach the top of it by being the most awesome person who's been helping me out. So, if you get some entertainment from my work and you've got a bit of cash to spare to help me dedicate more of my time to writing, then feel free to send me some help on Patreon. If you can't help out financially, that's cool. I was a poor uni student for a long time, and I'm just glad that I could help make your day a little bit better. But even without giving me cash, you can still help me out by telling someone that you might think would be interested in a podcast about science fiction and writing. And of course, if you want to show your true devotion to me, you can always build a giant space laser and burn my website URL into the face of the moon. I appreciate any level of support, and thank you for listening. So let's get into the meat and potatoes of this podcast. Today I want to talk about subverting expectations. With this being episode 10, I wanted to go big and have a topic that would definitely get under my skin that I could talk about in depth. Most weeks I have a half a page of dot points that I want to talk about when I get into this section of the podcast. Today I just have 2. Because this is a rant that I've almost rehearsed while talking to people. It's definitely got under my skin in the last couple of years. The kind of content that's been being produced and being put out there for people to consume is getting pretty laughable. I think the source of it came to a head with the release of The Last Jedi, the second of the final trilogy into the Skywalker saga, at least until Disney decides to make a new final trilogy into the Skywalker saga because they need more money. But rampant capitalism is a topic for another day's podcast. Today's topic is subverting expectations. This concept that if the audience doesn't see it coming, that they will enjoy it, that they need to be surprised, and that's all that needs to be done. So it's come up again and again in recent years in different forms of media, but just focusing on The Last Jedi as the example, there's questions set up in The Force Awakens that are answered by The Last Jedi by simply throwing a tantrum, essentially. Where questions like, who's Rey's parents? Why is she so powerful? Are answered with, Rey's parents are no one, she's powerful because she apparently just has to magically become powerful, because Kylo is so powerful and she just gets given power, I guess, by the universe in order to become as powerful as her. Questions like, how was Snoke able to reform the Empire into the First Order? How did the Resistance come to be what it is today? How did Luke manage to go from being this savior of the galaxy to this piece of crap old man who has given up on the Force and given up on his friends and given up on life? None of those questions are answered by the film. All of those questions are just thrown at the audience with no setup, no context into the previous story. There's no reason for them. I think audiences do want to have their expectations subverted, but the way to subvert expectation is by having the ending be surprising but inevitable. When you look back at the end of the story, the pieces that the end of the story should have been laid before you. One of the best examples of expectations being subverted well in recent years was The Sixth Sense. At the end of that movie, you're given an incredible, surprising ending, which some of the audience probably saw coming and some of them definitely didn't. You know, the hubbub around when that movie was new was that most of the audience didn't see the ending coming. And, you know, there was all this talk about spoilers and all of those sorts of things. But even when you go back and watch the movie, like, people went back into the cinema to watch the movie a second time, specifically so that they could identify the points in the story where the setup was made. Right? There are pieces in the film that tell you what's going to happen at the end, and when it happens, people are like, oh my god, it was so surprising, they didn't do any setup for that. But when you go back, they actually did, and they primed the audience for it. The Last Jedi doesn't do that at all. It doesn't set up the possible answers for questions, it doesn't explain how the characters got to where they were, it doesn't do any of that. Now, I admit that I'm pretty harsh on The Last Jedi, and I'm not that harsh on The Force Awakens, and the reason for that is it was a new world. It was the idea being that JJ had to prove that Disney could make a Star Wars film, and so as much as The Force Awakens has huge problems in it, massive problems, it's basically just a retelling of A New Hope with a little bit of Empire sort of shoved in there. They had to prove that they could write a Star Wars story. And so I was happy with it being a little slow to start off with in order to sort of get the audience into thinking of the new Star Wars paradigm. When we go into the cinema to see The Last Jedi, we're not looking for Disney to prove that they can tell a Star Wars story. It's already done that. We're looking for Disney to further this Star Wars story that they've set up with a bunch of JJ's horrible mystery boxes that were probably going to have bad answers. I mean, we can have a separate conversation about whether or not we should be having a question of, you know, whether or not Snoke being set up in the first place was a good idea or a bad idea. None of those things really matter. Those questions have been asked, and it was the responsibility of the Last Jedi to answer them in a satisfactory way. And ideally, if you want to subvert expectations, you needed to answer them in a way that was surprising but inevitable. And instead what we got was forced shock value. It's like watching a bad horror film. When you watch a good horror film, The scares are very psychological. You feel the intensity that's built up. When you're scared, you're actually scared. When you watch a bad horror film, it's jump scares, it's things that aren't set up, it's just all of a sudden the monster's there. All of the things that make a bad monster film are on display in The Last Jedi. The setups are just not done. All of a sudden the answers are because I said so. Why does Snoke have the power to do this incredible thing to connect these two Force users over half the galaxy, when we're told that Luke, who, as far as the audience is concerned, is the most powerful Force user that we're aware of in the entire universe, is unable to pull off such a feat, and also that when he does something similar at the end of the movie, it literally kills him. Why is Snoke so ridiculously powerful, and then in the end the movie says, oh, it doesn't really matter anyway because I killed him for no reason. Like, he was incredibly powerful, but apparently he had this flaw of not being able to detect the Force intention of Kylo Ren, even though he's the most powerful person in the room. Why was Kylo able to do that? There needed to be a setup scene that showed that Kylo was able to fool Snoke, but there wasn't. He didn't do that. So what ends up happening is you end up with characters that don't seem real. Why is Kylo able to kill Snoke? Because he can. Why is Rey able to fight with a lightsaber with no training whatsoever? Why is she able to use incredible force powers that it took other characters in much, much longer times to be able to use in universe? Well, none of those questions need to be answered because surprise. Surprise isn't good enough. We're talking about a leading movie in cinema. I mean, whatever you think of the Star Wars franchise, if you don't take it that seriously, if you think it's just a story about space wizards for children or whatever, you have to recognize that Star Wars and several other movies in the Star Wars franchise make up a significant portion of the top 100 highest grossing films of all time. On the top 100 list that I looked up, it had A New Hope at 94th of the top 100 list, Revenge of the Sith at 75, Phantom Menace at 39, Rogue One at 33, Last Jedi at 13, and The Force Awakens as the fourth highest grossing film of all time. So 6% of the top 100 grossing films of all time have been in the Star Wars franchise. 5 of the 8 of the core stories and Rogue One. For those of you who are wondering, Attack of the Clones came in at 136th of the highest grossing. Empire came in at 189 of the highest grossing films of all time, and Return of the Jedi came at 226. So in the top 250, I think in the top 300, Solo, which was an absolute disaster, came in the top 300. Okay, it came in at 301. Either way, 4 of the top 40, so 10% of the top 40 highest grossing movies of all time have been part of the Star Wars franchise. So it's hard to say that Star Wars doesn't really matter, and we don't need to think about it too much, because it's just a kid's movie and it doesn't need to tell a good story. Well, apparently this story is a massive earner, and people are going to write stories based on the formula that has been written here. Not to be overly pragmatic, but the stories that are going to get green-lighted by the people with the money enough to make these big stories are going to be movies that pass the muster that Star Wars had to pass in order to be made. And so, if the bar is set so low as we can make a movie just like The Last Jedi and everything will be fine and we'll be able to get finance because we can make an absolute piece of crap that doesn't have a consistent storyline, that completely breaks all of the canon, and it'll just be fine. We don't need to worry about writing a good story. We can make a shiny spectacle and people will come and watch it. And for me, I don't want a shiny spectacle when I go to the cinema. I want a good story. That's why I'm going. I don't begrudge a shiny spectacle. If I can have a shiny spectacle with a great story, it enhances the story. But a shiny spectacle with no story enhances nothing. You can't enhance nothing. It's already nothing. Going back and looking at that list of the top 100 grossing films of all time, there are a bunch of movies that I would put down to spectacle with nothing, no story substance underneath it. So on that list you've got Avatar, The Last Jedi, Iron Man 3, Captain Marvel, Transformers Age of Extinction, and there's another Transformers movie in there as well that's that like Mark Wahlberg era. Pirates 5, the Dead Men Tell No Tales, and 3 and 4 are also on that list too. All 3 of the Hobbit films and Batman vs Superman are all in the top 100 grossing films of all time. Now, admittedly, this list is not adjusted for inflation, as far as I can tell. So it's possible that there are movies in the past that were bigger and that might change some of those numbers, but we definitely know that movies now are making a lot more money than movies in the past did. They are such incredible money-making vehicles that, Solo threw a huge wrench into Disney's plans of making a movie every year because Solo only made $392 million. Apparently they spent $250 on film production and $150 on advertising, so the film actually came in at a worldwide loss. Hence why Disney has moved to this scheme of doing the movies that they plan to do. A Boba Fett movie, they plan to do a TV series called The Mandalorian, which is coming out in a little while, and they wanted to originally do a movie called Obi-Wan, which they're now, I think, going to do in a TV series, because TV series are a lot cheaper to make and easier to build, I guess. And Disney are certainly not the only culprits when it comes to doing bad subversion of expectations. It has infected Hollywood and the stories being produced of late. The final season of Game of Thrones subverted our expectations by just making a really terrible season. We didn't see that coming. Admittedly, with Game of Thrones, once they ran out of source material, the last few seasons definitely were a huge decline on what was sort of the golden age of Game of Thrones in the first 4 seasons. But in the final season, in the 3rd episode, it broke me when you have the conflict against the Night King. Obviously in the books there's no Night King, the others are not so easily killed as they are in the TV show, but the first scene of the book and the first scene of the TV show introduces the White Walkers, or the others in the book, right? It tells you that there's this existential threat which is outside of the realm of man that's making its machinations, it's doing things, and that we need to come together to defeat this world-changing, climate-based threat which is coming down from the North Pole. And then in the show they close out that storyline with 5 more hours of show to do. It's not the climax of the season, it's barely set up, and then when the Night King is killed by Arya, who has absolutely no connection, when all of the interaction and driving force of Jon Snow's character has been the existence of the White Walkers. His entire life, his journey for his entire life has been based around the existence of these creatures, and yet he's screaming at a dragon behind a rock, and then 2 episodes later the dragon flame is destroying whole castles and breaking down walls, but it couldn't burn through a rock. Look, the inconsistencies in the final season of Game of Thrones were abominable. But more so of the inconsistencies, the concept of subverting our expectations, of being like, well, you wouldn't expect Arya to come out of absolutely nowhere past a huge army of White Walkers who were apparently not on guard at all. We also had our expectations subverted by learning that Arya has learnt this incredible magic ability that to wear other people's faces and be an expert assassin, and then she never uses that power again in the season. She doesn't use that power in season 8 at all. What was the point of her going and learning that power? Well, there is no point, apparently. So, expectations subverted, except for the fact that when it gets to the end is surprising, but it's not inevitable. The surprising ends to the show are not earned. They don't feel deserved. It doesn't feel like a complete story. It feels like someone picked how are we going to end Game of Thrones out of a hat of suggestions. And that hat of suggestions was written by someone who was writing for a different show. Audiences want their expectations to be subverted, but they don't want their expectations to be random. They want them to be foreshadowed. Without the proper setup, if the ending isn't earned, the story won't be seen as being complete. And we see that in The Last Jedi, although that's not the ending. But, I mean, I have to say, with the Rise of Skywalker coming out in a couple of weeks, I definitely don't envy the job that J.J. Abrams has had to do to try and solve how many law-breaking things went on in The Last Jedi. The story has told us, oh well, Luke's dead and he wasn't really anything at all, and the Force doesn't have the rules that we were told the rules have in the past, and goddamn hyperspace drive works differently, apparently, than it was worked in the past. Like, none of that makes any damn sense. The Holdo maneuver, for example, is an incredible spectacle. When it happens, when you're sitting in the cinema and you see this spray of white spray through this armada of enemy ships, it's breathtaking. And then a half a second later you think, oh god, that's broken all of Star Wars now. Because what was the conflict in the last movie? If they could just set a ship in hyperdrive, put one person on a ship to kamikaze into the big thing that they had to break through, and we are told in the last, in The Force Awakens, that we can hyperdrive through shields, so it isn't a problem anymore. That whole battle in the last film, where a bunch of people in TIE fighters and in X-Wings were killed trying to destroy the big MacGuffin, whatever that was, hexagon thing, to blow up the evil Starkiller base. They could have done that by just putting one person on a big ship and flying it directly into the extractor or the regulator or whatever that hexagon building was. Why did so many people have to lose their lives to destroy that thing? Like, a ton of people died. And all of those, even if you're like, oh, well, it costs big money to build a big hyperdrive ship, all of those people that we see die were in ships that have hyperdrives. All the X-Wings have hyperdrives. So if you use the hyperdrive on an X-Wing to fly through that, surely that would make the same level of explosion that Han made by just putting, the little bombs on the interior. Anyway, I digress. That movie is a terrible movie. I will do my best to try and remove it from my brain, which might be a little difficult since in preparation for the new movie coming out, I'm going to review all 8 of the previous movies, including The Last Jedi, the week before the new movie comes out. So you can look forward to that review. It's going to be like 4 lines long. This movie was terrible. So trying to get back on track, it's not just Star Wars or Game of Thrones that has fallen prey to this poison of subverting expectations but not linking the random thing that happened to any foreshadowing. In the last few years, we've had Terminator Genesis, The Village, Suicide Squad, Prometheus, Man of Steel, Iron Man 3, and Batman vs Superman. They all tell us that they're going to do one thing, then they do another thing with zero setup. It often feels like the third act in those films isn't connected to the previous 2 acts, that it was written by somebody else, that it was written by committee, that, I don't know, it's just bad fan fiction. I'm not interested in bad fan fiction. I want good, actual good science fiction to be the thing that's earning all of the money and being produced. But we're going to get what we're going to get. I mean, there's always a market for terrible things. 50 Shades got 3 movies. There are, however, movies that have come out lately that are pretty good. Even if they didn't make necessarily a lot of money. Movies like Birdman, Ex Machina, The Dark Knight all subverted expectations or genres in a surprising but inevitable way. Oh god, I was just checking that list again, and there's Jurassic World and Fallen Kingdom on both 6 and 14 respectively in the highest grossing movies of all time. So I guess we can just expect Hollywood to pump out a slurry of absolutely terrible movies with no expectation of making a good story that people can actually enjoy. Well, I will do my best to write stories that do fit the bill. I'm at least thinking that there's more to subverting expectations than just jump scares, and hopefully that makes for better storytelling. Anyhow, next week my Tuesday story will be called The Watchmen. It's from a random idea that poked its way into my brain. I'm going to do a review of Terminator, the first one. I might talk about the second one a little bit and how the subsequent ones have all been horrific. The Thursday story for next week is from a prompt called Lightspeed Sickness, and the topic of next week's podcast is the trope that all the impressive stuff that ancient people did were all done by aliens. Remember that you can always send me prompts for stories if you want to give me a challenge, or if you want to contact me for any other reason to comment or ask me a question. You can contact me at contact@robert-lynch.com or on Twitter @BobLynchBSC. If you like what I do and you want to help me make more of it, you can check out my Patreon at patreon.com/RobertLynch. As always, check out my website for new stuff every weekday, and I will see you next week.